Hey there, Gators! Welcome back for another lecture review. This one is on personality. So as always, we start out with our student learning outcomes. So we'll be able to evaluate theories of personality, discuss influences on personality, and discuss stability and change and how we assess personality. So as always, we have to start out with a definition. So what is personality? We've got a great definition here, so I've highlighted some of the most important parts there. Our personalities are long-standing traits and patterns, so they last for a long time, and they consistently show up. So they're how we consistently think, feel, and behave. So personalities are central to the individual, they're consistent, they last throughout our lifetime. The word personality comes from this Latin word persona, which meant a mask that was worn by an actor. And so we'll kind of come back to this idea, though, of personality being a mask that we wear. So it's kind of who we are, who we show the world. And some people believe that that personality is conscious to varying degrees, that we select it to varying degrees. So we'll talk about some of these theories of personality. Some of our earliest perspectives on personality come from Hippocrates, who thought that this was related to the fluids or the humors of the body. So we can kind of see this here. We've got blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. So he thought that people would fall into these categories then, and Galen kind of expanded on this and said that our personality is shaped by having imbalances within these humors. Another science we don't really follow at this point, but it was more of a historical perspective, is phrenology. So Gall thought that he could actually reach in there, feel through your head. If there were lumps, then you might have excess of that personality. If there were divots, then you had lower amounts of that personality trait. So we don't really follow this idea of being able to feel the skull and no personality, nor understanding kind of fluids in the body. But those were some of the first attempts to really understand personality. But Freud really helped us. So this is one of the things he did do for psychology, was he helped us to get this first kind of perspective on what it means to have a personality. So it's the very first kind of comprehensive theory of personality. And he thought that our personality was derived from unconscious desires. So with Freud, it's almost always sex and aggression, and that's what we see here, as well as things we've experienced in childhood and transitions that we went through as a child. So Freud was kind of the first person to say, let's look at this personality in a complex manner and try to understand, what we can see from personality and what predicts personality. He did think that only about 1/10 of our mind was conscious, so we end up getting kind of this iceberg metaphor that you can see the picture there. So the very top of the iceberg is what we're consciously aware of, and then all the rest of that is underneath the surface. So it's kind of the 90% of it that's unconscious, that drives our behavior, that we don't truly think about or kind of have awareness of. So that unconscious we can't access, but we can access it through certain other means. So even though it's not conscious to us, we can get it from understanding Freudian slips. So this is when you say one thing but mean your mother. I mean another. I have some examples linked in below as well for Freudian slips. But it's kind of saying one thing, but you didn't really mean to say it, but your unconscious mind slips out. As well as understanding dreams, and then having people free associate. So you just start talking. So you might, they might give you a topic like, talk about your mother. And then you're just going to keep going and going and going and kind of see where that leads you. And the idea that eventually would lead you into your unconscious. The psychodynamic theory is based in Freud's work, so he thought that this personality was this kind of conflict between our biological drives for aggression and sex and our internal kind of socialized drives that we have that come from society. So he thought that we had 3 parts to our personality, or 3 parts of our mind. The id was there first, so it's that biological pleasure principle. And then we've developed this ego and superego. So the ego is reality, so it helps us to bring together the good and the bad. The superego is more of that morality piece, so kind of learning right from wrong. So we start with that id, and then eventually we learn, the part that we're going to show to society, as well as the part that kind of helps us to maintain good, appropriate behavior. So it's almost like those little devil and angel on your shoulder trying to tell you what to do, is what Freud thought. So this is Freud's theory. Freud also thought that at times there can be this conflict between the id and the superego, so that kind of conflict between the little devil and angel on your shoulders, that this conflict was unconscious and it made us uncomfortable. So we would have to do certain things to kind of get rid of this discomfort. So we've got a whole list of things here that we call defense mechanisms that help us to refuse kind of this anxiety, to relieve this anxiety. I'm sure you've heard of many of these defense mechanisms already. They've really kind of implanted into our society. But if we are in denial, we refuse to accept an event. If we displace, then we might take some anger that we have at a target we can't attack, like our boss, and they put that on our cat. So we're angry at our boss, but we yell at our cat. So we displace onto an acceptable target. For projection, this is when you yourself have a desire that you find acceptable, and you say, you're going to put that on somebody else then. You say that they have it. So maybe you have a desire to cheat on your girlfriend or boyfriend, but you put that on them and say they have that desire to cheat on you. So you're kind of transferring that urge onto another person. Rationalizing is just justifying behaviors to try and make yourself feel better when you do something, and you kind of just say, well, there's lots of reasons for me doing that. Reaction formation is probably one of my favorite defense mechanisms. I think it's fascinating. So with this, you've got some kind of belief that you find to be bad, and then you're going to adopt a belief that's contrary to that belief. So you might, I think a recent or somewhat recent example of this was one of the Duggar children, Josh Duggar. He served on a religious council that was against adultery and against engaging in sex outside of marriage. So he was having this position of power in this moral authority of not engaging in adultery. But then it comes to find that he himself was using the internet to engage in adultery from his own wife. So he was adopting this whole belief system and advocating for this belief system that was very different from the one that he was actually living in his real life. He had those desires for adultery and was committing adultery, but then lived a public life of shaming adultery. So Freud would call that reaction formation. Regression is when something happens and we kind of go back to an earlier stage of development. So maybe you have an 8-year-old, parents get divorced, the 8-year-old starts wetting the bed again, even though they haven't done that for 5 years. So they're regressing to a previous state of development. Repression is kind of trying to push down bad memories and not think about them. And then sublimation is when you have urges that you can't fulfill that may be aggressive or sexual in nature, so you channel that energy elsewhere. So maybe you're trying to avoid engaging in sexual activity, so you clean your house. So you're trying to use that urge and that desire and put it towards something else that is acceptable to you. So that explains kind of some of these major defense mechanisms that Freud came up with. So we've got a lot of different ones there. There's also something linked in at the bottom where you can try to identify these as well in real life scenarios. So what we'll see then is a little bit more Freud. So our psychodynamic theory, we've got these stages of psychosexual development. So Freud thought that we moved through our development in a psychosexual way. So psychosexual is what he called this. So he thought we all started out as kids in this oral stage. It's our very first stage. So this is where we get our pleasure from the mouth. The anal stage was next, and that has to do with feces and holding feces. The phallic stage has to do with more of the sexual organs. And at this part, we see the Oedipus or Electra complex. So with the Oedipus complex, what we see is that the young boy will have sexual feelings towards his mother and will then have feelings that the father is a competition. So feelings of sexual love towards the mother and feeling that the father is a competition. And so this is what Freud would call the Oedipus complex and thought it was developmentally normal during this phallic stage. Girls would have the opposite complex, so they have sexual feelings towards their father and feelings of competition towards their mother. And he thought this was something that we had to resolve before moving on in our development. The latency stage, we don't see much sexual motivation present, and the genital stage becomes when we start to focus on sexual relationships as adults. So as you can see, this is very much a theory. This is not something that psychologists have proven or necessarily believe. It's just what Freud thought was happening during these different stages, and a lot of psychologists have really moved beyond this idea of development being focused in sex. Freud did believe, though, that if you were over or underindulged during these stages, that you could develop a fixation. So if you've heard of someone being like anally retentive or orally fixated, that kind of language comes from Freud. And this oral fixation could be then you didn't get enough of the mouth pleasure as a young child, and so then now you want to smoke cigarettes or chew your thumbs or always have gum in your mouth, so you're trying to get that oral pleasure now. So you'd say you're fixated orally. These are just some funny comics about Freud you can read. I love some Freud comics. Then we've had researchers move beyond Freud. So we call these our neo-Freudians. They're based in a lot of Freud's work, but they really extend it and move past it. Alfred Adler was one of these individuals, and he thought that we were really motivated by gaining superiority, but that we could develop an inferiority complex. So then we feel less than other people. We feel like we don't measure up. So this can then drive our personality as feeling inferior to others. Erikson is a neo-Freudian that we'll spend a lot of time talking about in class. We've already spent some time talking about in class. But he was that psychosocial theory of development, so not just sexual, it's actually social, and thought we moved through these periods in the lifespan where we try and resolve some form of crisis to keep developing our personality in a satisfactory manner. Carl Jung is a psychologist that is quite famous for many different reasons. Some of his biggest theories were this introversion-extroversion idea, which many people have heard of and we'll come back to. He also thought that personality was this mask that we adopt. So it's kind of this compromise between who we truly are and who society will accept us to be. And then we wear that personality like a mask. He also had this idea that we have our own unconscious. So kind of like Freud, we have this personal unconscious that's deep within us. But additionally, we have a collective unconscious. So what this is something that we all possess. It's memory that traces back to all people. And he says that he believed that this occurred because if you look across many cultures, they have similar archetypes. So they have like heroes, stories about maidens and tricksters, and all of these individual characters or archetypes that are present between all of these cultural stories, even when those cultures never had contact with one another. So he thought we were relying then on this personal and then collective unconscious to make these stories up. Another neo-Freudian that we'll discuss is Karen Horney. So with Freud, he thought that individuals experienced penis envy. So this was women who experienced penis envy, and that they had this kind of anxious desire, this drive, this wish that they had a penis. Well, Horney thought this was not the case, and she said that men actually experience womb envy. So they are jealous or have that unconscious drive or desire to have a womb, and they're jealous that they don't have one and can't bring life onto the planet. So she kind of took this penis envy and switched it a little bit there. She also had some other ideas, so she thought that our personality could be shaped by how we cope with anxiety. So some of us will move toward people, so we'll kind of make those friendships. Others will move against people, so be more aggressive. And then finally some will move away from people and become withdrawn. So she thought that this process shaped our personality as well. So that gets us out of our neo-Freudians and into our learning or behaviorism-based approaches. So as you remember from behaviorism, this is really saying that behavior is kind of shaped by reinforcements and consequences, and they believe personality is shaped much the same. So they thought it really is that nurture component, and that we will then differ based on situations. Some of the theories that fall within this are the social cognitive perspective, which we've talked about, but this is just kind of saying that learning and cognition are influencing our personality. We learn from watching other people, which relies on the work from Bandura. We also rely on this kind of intermix between behavior, cognitive factors, and situation, which we call reciprocal determinism. So if you think about when you went into, apply to come to college. So that was the behavior that shaped then your cognitive factors. So it shaped, I am now a college student. That's a thought that you might have. And it'll shape the situations you find yourself in. So you find yourself in the bookstore purchasing books. You find yourself in emailing a professor. You find yourself in the classroom. So you're going to be in these different situations based on these behaviors and these thoughts that you have. So the idea there would be that our personality would be shaped by this mix of behavior, cognitive factors, and situational factors. And that would be our reciprocal determinism. Also with our learning approaches, we have self-efficacy. So we've talked about self-efficacy before, but it's this level of kind of believing that you're capable of doing something. We also all have a locus of control that kind of dictates whether or not we believe that we have power in our lives. So if you have an internal locus of control, you think that you control your destiny, that you're the one in charge. And so these individuals, their personality would be shaped by this belief that they are the ones in charge of their life. Those of us with an external locus of control instead believe that other people or the situation kind of controls what's going to happen to you. So it's more based in fate rather than based on personal choice. So obviously you can imagine individuals with an internal versus external locus of control are going to, view events very differently. They're going to have different personalities, different experiences. And there's also this debate between, within learning theory especially, that personality really might not be consistent across situations. So it's kind of this, what's the personality trait, what's a situational impact, and they kind of do research trying to understand and negotiate this difference between personality and situations. One area that we kind of know that can shape us a lot is our self-regulation, our self-control ability. So if you've got individuals who typically are very kind to others. If their self-regulation or self-control has been incredibly taxed by a very difficult day, they may lash out. So it might just be something about that situation or that ability to regulate oneself that then we start to lash out at other people, so our personality seems to shift. So that's a little of our learning approaches. We have a little bit on humanism. So we're familiar with humanism from the class, but it really is that idea that people are good, that they're inherently good, that they have free will. And we think then that personality under this perspective has to do with choices and with experiences that people have had. And so there's many ways then to support personality or to approach personality. So we can look at it from the hierarchy of needs perspective, that we can see kind of how people, if they'll eventually get to that self-actualization, that their personality will be something that they're fully satisfied with, that they have, this complete knowledge of self and who they are. Carl Rogers thought there needed to be a congruence between the real self and the ideal self. So he wanted to help people understand, what is your ideal, what do you really want to be like, and to help them to bring that in line with who they truly were. And so he thought that this was fostered from a young age by our caregivers, and that they would really view us with this form of unconditional positive regard. So no matter what we did, they would love us, that they would hold us in positive regard no matter what, and love us without condition. So love us no matter what. So he thought that these two factors, this positive regard and love, to an unconditional standard, were really important for helping us to know kind of who we are and to live that ideal self and that real self and have that congruence between the two. We also have some biological approaches of personality. So we know from some twin studies that there are some aspects of personality that do appear to have some polygenetic influences. Temperament is something that occurs early on in the lifespan. So we see babies have a temperament right from birth. Some are easy, some are difficult. And this approach seems to persist as well. So it's something that, they're kind of born with, that persists throughout the lifespan. And there's been some individuals who believe this body type can tell us a lot about personality. So this is an ectomorph, endomorph, and mesomorph. You can see the different body types there. And there's this belief maybe that some personality traits correlate with those body types. But this really is pretty subjective. It's not strongly based in research like the temperament and twin study information is. One big theory, though, so we've talked about all these kind of historical theories, all these different ways of viewing personality, the Freudians and Neo-Freudians. But one big aspect of personality that we truly do test and kind of believe and follow these days is the trait theory. So if you were to measure your own personality, you're probably going to use a trait-based approach. And this is the idea that we want to be able to measure individual differences and that our personality can be understood as a unique combination of these traits and characteristics that we possess. And you might be able to use a mathematical technique called a factor analysis, which helps to understand, how traits kind of bundle and bunch together in individuals. So if we looked at someone like Mr. Rogers or looked at Oprah, and we tried to say, who are these people? What you're going to start listing when you try to explain Oprah or Mr. Rogers are traits. So if we just take Oprah, for example, we say she's generous, she's kind, she's empathetic, she's really good with people, she, is able to understand emotions well. So we're labeling all of these different things that Oprah possesses, and those would be individual traits that we can say are related to her. So all of those things we've listed are traits. So historically then, people have tried to understand traits and how many traits we have, how many traits make up an individual. Allport found tons and tons of words describing people. We just tried to organize into 3 categories. So cardinal traits would be these ones that describe your entire personality. Those are pretty rare. Central traits are more of what we were talking about with Oprah, so kind and generous and empathetic. Those make up our personality. And then secondary traits are really just not as obvious or consistent, so maybe they're important for our personality, but to a lesser degree. Raymond Cattell was thinking, hey, this is so many traits. This is really intensive. It'd be very difficult to measure. So he tried to narrow it down. So he ended up narrowing it down to 171 traits, which is a big narrow, narrowing down quite a bit. And then had 16 factors that he believed we all kind of possessed, but to a different degree. So if our first one you can see there is reserved unsociable versus outgoing sociable. So the idea there would be that some of us would fall more towards the left, some of us would fall more towards the right. So he developed in this 16 PF that you can still take today if you're interested to try and see where you kind of fall on each of these characteristics. Eisenach also looked at traits but really focused more on this temperament biology piece. And they focused really heavily initially on this extroversion introversion and neuroticism stability component. So you're able to kind of see this in the picture here. They also later included psychoticism, superego control, but really they were coming more from a biological perspective and were including some of these factors that we now use in the most common assessment, which is this ocean model or the 5-factor model. So if you get your personality tested today, many times it's going to be based in this 5-factor ocean model. So the idea here would be that everyone possesses all 5 of these ocean traits or these 5-factor traits, but they occur along that spectrum. So the traits are openness to experience. So if you're lower on that trait, then you're conventional, you prefer routine. If you're higher on that trait, then you're very open, curious, independent. So the idea would be that we all fall somewhere in between this continuum on these traits. So we have openness, we have conscientiousness, so kind of that competence, goal-driven behavior. Extroversion is more of the assertiveness and sociability. Agreeableness is being trustworthy, cooperative. And then neuroticism is having more of those unstable emotions. So the idea is that we would all have a score on these, and some of us would be high on others, some of us low, but we'd be able to kind of understand our personality based on how we fall along these 5 traits. So this is a very common perspective that we often see utilized. Culture is really important for personality. So if we look across cultures, we can see that there are certain kind of characteristics or traits that are more common. So in some of our Asiatic cultures, we see less extroversion. South American cultures, higher on openness. Europeans, often higher in neuroticism. And if we look across certain regions within the United States, we're more likely to see kind of agreeableness in the South, for example, than we are in the North. So kind of based on these, where we live, the people we're around, this shapes our personality. And we also see this based on the values that we hold. So some of our individualistic cultures really value that competition, personal achievement. So we see more personalities based on these factors. And our collectivist cultures really rely more on that harmony and respectfulness, group needs. So we'll see then more individuals with personalities that are shaped towards these group desires. So then how do we assess personality? This is where we needed to, or where we're going to get to end, is how we assess it. So we've talked about all these ideas of what is personality, what are theories behind personality, but we really want to be able to test personality and see, what are people like. So a lot of ways that we'll do this are self-report inventories. So they might ask these Likert scales, like 1 to 5. So strongly disagree to strongly agree. You might have done these many times when you fill out surveys. A big popular one that is often given for criminal trials or to see if people should get a job is the MMPI. So this is lots of true-false questions. You can see some simulated, Freudian slip. See some simulated questions there from the MMPI too. So I'm very tense on the job. I am often worried about sex. And then you would say true or false. This has been updated many times. Now it's about 338 questions instead of 550, and we're able to see if people are lying, faking. There's lots of scales to kind of look at this stuff, validity, reliability, so it's a very well assessed scale. The 16PF we've already mentioned, but if you're interested in Cattell's theory, his trait theory of the 16 factors, you're able to take that one. Many of us have probably had experience with this one, the Myers-Briggs. So with this, it's instead of looking at specific personality traits, it's more putting people into types. So you might end up being like an ENFJ or an ISTP or whatever have you. You might end up falling somewhere on in these specific types. So this research can be really good. Many people feel like the Myers-Briggs suits them well, but it can also be difficult because we don't all neatly fall into a specific type. So that was our subjective or self-reflective, self-report types of questionnaires. These ones are more subjective. So this is our personality tests that are projective. So they're more subjective, they are projective, and the idea would be that you'd be projecting something about your own unconscious onto the stimulus materials in these tests. So you're projecting from inside, from your unconscious, onto the stimulus materials. So we have the ink blots that you may have seen for this. This is Rorschach. We have the thematic apperception test, the TAT, so this is telling a story about a picture. And then we have the Roderson incomplete sentence blank. So we'll get a chance to look at each of these. So for our ink blot tests, you get ink blots such as this, or that one, or that one. So we've got all 4 of our ink blots up there. So you would be asked then to kind of look at these individually and state what you see in them. Kind of supposed to answer relatively quickly, the first thing that comes to your mind. So you might say a butterfly, you might say 2 people fighting, you might say sexual activity, whatever it is you say, then they're thinking that you're projecting your unconscious states onto these photographs. These are just some comics about the Rorschach that are really funny, I think. So, who's this guy and why does he keep painting pictures of my parents fighting? So if you were looking at every one of these ink blots and seeing your parents fighting, then he would say that you're projecting that, desire to talk about those issues that your parents are having, that you're worried about those issues, that they're unconsciously bothering you. The TAT uses pictures, so you'd be asked to look at these photographs here and indicate what is happening in this picture. So you can come up with all different kinds of stories about what's happening here, here, and there. So we're able to indicate what we think is going on. So you'll be able to give that story relatively quickly, and again, that's working on the idea that you're projecting from your own experiences onto these photographs. And then our final one is this Rotter test. So with this, you just get this little incomplete blank, and the idea is that you would fill in the rest of the information with something from your own experiences. So the happiest time, and you just kind of say that as quickly as you can, and explain. So a mother is someone who loves you. So that just came right out of my head, number 11. Sports are fun to watch, 16. So you would just, say that first part and then just completely fill it out the rest of the way. And you try to make complete sentences and do it quickly and express your real feelings. So that is some of our projective tests. So we've been through the ideas of what is personality, some theories of personality, and then how we measure personality. And that's it, Gators. Thank you so much.